Dear God, thank you that we get to meet together this Sabbath. Thank you that we've been given the space to grow. And thank you for the crisis that we're in. I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Yesterday we ended by describing how this characteristic that we've been talking about, this characteristic of the Old Covenant, has changed its clothes through the different dispensations of the Old Covenant. First, we touched on the era of society organized around individuals. The tribal world. I picked out one individual in that world. Before moving on to describing ancient Israel. And the blessings and cursings that we're more familiar with. That framework of seeing the world through conditionality didn't disappear once Israel disappeared. Once Israel lost its kings. Because all that conditionality was tied to the behavior of the king. Or the leaders of Israel. And how they organized that nation. But when Israel goes into exile, and that nationhood is stripped away from them, what comes out are the scribes and the Pharisees that gather the Israelites around the law. And blessings and cursings are framed around adherence to the law. Or should I say, how well someone keeps the law. But as soon as that container bursts, in 34 AD, the expectation would be that conditionality for humanity stops. Because Israel, that boundary, is destroyed. And what we're left with is Christendom. But the whole Christian framework gets shaped in the same way of blessings and cursings. We can point to one period that we can take out of Christendom. I'll call it the rule of the papacy. And we can see how religion, Christianity, was framed around this idea of the insiders and the outsiders. So the reformers do a lot of work to dismantle that thinking. And by the time you get to 1798, and the world starts to secularize, nation states start forming, separate to the ties to Christendom. And so one would think that by dispensing of the religious clothing, by putting away religious clothes, this idea of blessings and cursings would fade away. But once nation states form, the same thinking just morphs into different clothes. I won't go. Blessing went through a lot of detail to describe how we got to the formation of the LIO. In the aftermath of World War I and World War II. And he pointed out something significant that we may have just seen pass by, which was the reframing of the causes of those wars from evil people and good people to just people with emotions. I hope you can sit with that thought, because it's going to come up again when we deal with other issues. In any case, the LIO gets formed out of the ashes of the WIO. And when this system is getting built, the intent is to create a fair system. So while we point out the weaknesses or limitations of the LIO, I hope no one walks away thinking that it's a system created by evil people. Because in other studies, we can point to the beauties of the LIO. But in creating this apparently fair system, with the desire to put away with the inequality of aristocracy. So running away from aristocracy, in search of a new way to organize society. If I were to ask you, how would you organize society? Who would you get to run society? Where under aristocracy, society was separated into the nobility and the peasants, those that weren't nobles. If you want to dispense of that because you see the evil of it, who would you get to run society? And what society coalesced around ended up with, what society ended up with was that we should get the most qualified people to run society. The term I used was technocrats, which is just people who have authority because they have technical expertise in the given domain. So not politicians, they are just, I'll say, puppets of the technocrats. Not kings who are appointed by divine right, but experts, because they know better, because they have an education. On the surface, that seems fair. It seems right. But what that left was a side effect. Was that as more and more decisions about the common good were left in the hands of these technocrats, discussions about what was good for society gravitated away from what they call the public square, where citizens had a voice to disagree about values, to debate about what is just and unjust, because the decision was that the educated people know better. There's an element of naivety that ended up sweeping through this system. And this naivety was in assuming that a world of conditionality had died, had been dispensed with. But as Blessing described yesterday, the same system ended up creating the same society of winners and losers. The blessed and the cursed. I refer again to Blessing's study because he used two terms that describe both areas in which this LIO affected the world. The neoliberal consensus that dealt with nations, and the Washington consensus that dealt with individuals. Under the neoliberal consensus, nations were told that if they integrated smoothly into the LIO, that they would be blessed. That blessing was in the form of getting access to the global market. But if you don't integrate, then you're cursed with sanctions or closing off access to collaboration. And so by telling a nation to fix itself, it ended up carrying the exact same message as a curse. The danger in this system, or how it was created under a world of patriarchy, is that the system didn't recognize itself as doing this. Because the belief was the system is fair. So nobody inside that system could recognize the damage. That was quietly building underneath. Not only limited to the nations arguing at the various summits that take place through the year, but the impact that it had on individuals whose lives those technical decisions affected. We haven't described that damage yet. But that damage doesn't get seen from within the system until it's too late. Until someone rises up or something outside that system to demand to tear it down. Because in the words of Blessing, the cry was, we've had enough. When trying to explain how we got here, and by year I mean 2026, 2024, 2016, all these populist turning points, this backlash against this system, we've described it as a culture war. Not just us, but we'll say the media. And two causes are often linked. Causes that led to of why this is happening. The first is bigotry. So it's said that these people are just bigots. They're just racist because they don't want immigrants living in their countries. And while that may have an element of truth, I'd suggest it can't be the full explanation. Because it doesn't account for why that backlash landed along a very specific line. Education. Whether someone held a university degree, turned out to be the clearest demarcation or the clearest predictor of which side of this culture war someone ended up on. So our explanation needs to be able to take this into account. The second explanation that's often given is economic dislocation. What I mean by that is the idea that the economy has changed its location. So people who once had access to jobs see their jobs moved overseas. And so the explanation of why there's this populist backlash is they're just demanding more wages. While again that may have an element of truth, it doesn't quite explain the tone of the reaction that we see. Because what ended up surfacing was something angrier and more personal than just demanding of more wages. It was this sense of being looked down on, um, and being dismissed by the elites. I'm deliberately using the language that the populace use. Because if we're going to understand what's going on, we have to look at the problem objectively, not in the way the left has. Because this cry isn't merely a language of lost income. The cry is given in the language of being humiliated. People feeling humiliated by the system. Both of those explanations, bigotry and economic dislocation, let the system off the hook too easily. They don't attribute enough blame to the system. There's a wider reaching explanation that we could give, which I'm suggesting is this mechanism we've been tracing. Of blessings and cursings. This idea of conditional acceptance. But as I described yesterday, this mechanism has reached its final form as it's matured over time. And in a secular world, without a God to dish out those blessings and cursings, what has sorted people into the blessed and the cursed is the idea of a meritocracy. A world built on merit. When you hold up meritocracy against the thing that it's replacing, I'll use the term autocracy, it looks beautiful. initially. Because for most of history, under, we'll say, the king system, a person's life was decided by birth. So, who one's parents were, what class they were born into, whether they had a title in society, all of that a person couldn't earn their way out of. You couldn't escape where you were born. No matter how much talent you had, or how much effort you put into trying to escape. And so by building a world that runs on merit, the promise was that we would have a just society in comparison, where one's status wasn't handed down by blood, and you could earn your rise through your talent and hard work. If you just worked hard enough, you could rise. That was the promise that the LIO gave people. That if you just build the right sorting system, of schools, exams, universities, and just let people rise as far as their ability could take them, that would lead to a more just society. With the promise that your life is finally yours. But this promise began to break down. The elite institutions that we have in the world are genuinely more diverse by race and sex as they were generations ago. That part of the promise held. But once we investigate and look a bit closer, we begin to see that there's a new blessed class. And we can see that the pattern of blessings and cursings hasn't really gone away. Because now you're blessed is that new meritocratic elite. Those with an education. And it's just as hard to move from generation to generation as it was in this era. Because once a family gets an education in one of those elite universities, colleges, that privilege just ends up getting passed down. That ends up shaping the children, whether it's through the connections that that family has, or having enough money to provide enough tutoring for their kids. We could go on and on about the various soft advantages that get passed down from generation to generation, that end up not actually creating a meritocratic society. We've spoken about intergenerational wealth, and when we talk about that, it's not just about money or land, because intergenerational wealth in the society today is that thing we all love, that thing we all need: education. Which ended up sorting society into winners and losers, educated and uneducated. The problem isn't that some people end up with more money than others. It's when a system like this becomes more than just an economic one. It becomes a system that's moral, where a person's worth ends up getting tied to their education, or how much they succeed in life. Because in this moral system, built into it is an idea, a claim about what people deserve. The thinking that if sorting by education genuinely works, I don't know what I said. Sorry. The thinking that if this kind of sorting mechanism works, if talent and effort really do determine outcome, then success isn't just something you end up with. It ends up being what you deserve. When framed from that perspective, it may sound innocent, but the opposite of that, whether you mean it or not, is that if success is deserved, then the absence of success is deserved too. So someone who's not successful is not successful because they deserve it. Not because they had less luck, but because they deserve it. In the Old Testament, there are a group of books called the wisdom literature. And Ecclesiastes is part of this collection of books. And the theme of the book of Ecclesiastes wrestles with this same problem. But it's as if, as Christians, we've read what, I'm going to say, Solomon had to say, and that one outlier book doesn't represent how God actually works. Because the premise or the argument that Solomon makes is that the race doesn't go to the fastest. The battles don't get won by the strongest. The wise don't get the food. He looked around and watched skill and effort get beaten by something else entirely. Time and chance. Luck. But we've looked at that book and said, that's an outlier. That's not normal. What is normal is everything I read about God everywhere else. That people are blessed or cursed depending on their effort, depending on how well they behave. I'll pause here because I don't want to get misunderstood, and I want to emphasize that none of this means that skill and effort don't count for anything. They do matter. It's just that credentials or an education have quietly become the measure of the person's worth, their standing as a human being. And that's far more dangerous than explicit blessings and cursings. Which is why the Old Covenant, or the LIO, had to end. It had to break up. So when we mark the close of probation in 2026, and we see a power rise up to dispense of a system, we can either look with horror or we can look with praises in sight of the thing that's going to replace that broken system. When I say broken, I mean a good system, the LIO, that had to grow under a world of patriarchy. So when we think of why this ends up being significant, it's that it ends up marking something more than a patch, a temporary fix to a system that will eventually correct itself. Instead, it's tearing apart a system that was supported by mechanisms that could have never built a just society. And that's what we want going forward. So I said we were going to come back to the story of Job. So I'll touch on that for a few minutes. Because embedded in that story, right at the beginning, before Israel ever rose up, was a reminder about who God is and the way God sees the world. I've always loved this story about Job from when I was a child. Because in that story, you had Job's friends who who play out this mechanism of blessings and cursings. Their worldview is built on a meritocratic claim. on a claim that you get what you deserve. Because if blessings track obedience, all those things we listed that made Job rich was seen through the eyes of he is a just man, an obedient man. So he must be blessed. So as soon as Job starts suffering, his mates go up to him and say, your suffering must be because of sin. And God is going to intervene amongst all of this. And instead of pulling up all of Job's sins, God spends chapters showing Job a world that has nothing to do with merit at all. Where care is extended to places no human would ever see, to creatures that exist outside of human control or use, to try and point Job in the direction of seeing that his worth and so his right to care was never tied to anything he did. But Job's friends, their whole world view assumes that everything gets lined up with what people deserve. But God couldn't say that too explicitly. So he takes Job down a rabbit hole instead. The point that I wanted to make from all of that is that under this whole mechanism or this whole dispensation of the Old Covenant, I described God as using a mechanism of conditionality to try and reshape or grow humans' minds so that eventually humanity could recognize their worth and understand equality. But amidst all of that, God interspersed reminders, dropped little reminders that a person's worth, a person's rights, were never tied to what they do. This debate about a just society, about what people deserve out of life, has been going on for some time now. Until a bunch of scholars, philosophers, decided they needed to address this head on. By this, I mean the connection between merit and what people deserve. So I'm going to point you in the direction of one of those philosophers. His name is John Rawls, an American. He wrote extensively about what we've discussed. In a book called A Theory of Justice. And his argument in his literature is based on a thought experiment. Imagine you're designing the rules of a society from scratch. So nothing's been created yet. You have no lived experience. But there's a catch. So I want you to perform this thought experiment live. And try and think through what your answers are to this thought experiment. This would be more fun if we were in person. So for now, you'll just have to deal with me talking to you. So design a society from scratch. But there's a catch. You have no idea who you're going to be inside that society once it's built. So all you get to do is build the rules, but you don't know who you're going to be once that society is built. You don't know what your talents are going to be, who your family is going to be, what the status of your health will be, and you don't know whether you're going to be born rich or poor. So he would call this the veil of ignorance. And you're standing on this side of that veil, trying to design the rules of the society that you could live in. You're designing it blind. think about what that actually does to how you design things. If you knew in advance that you'd be born gifted and wealthy, I don't know about you, as but me for sure, I would design a system that rewards gifted people, that rewards wealthy people with more wealth. I'm honest about myself because I know I'm selfish. But if you don't know any of that, you might turn out to be the person born with nothing, born into the worst circumstances possible. What would a rational person do? How would they design the system? Not knowing whether they turn out to be rich or poor. It's just a gamble. If it were me, I'd design a system that protects whoever ends up worst off. Worst off. So I'd protect, I'd build that system to make sure that the rules protect whoever ends up poor. Because it might be me. I don't know. So I'd make sure the system accounts for every possibility. There's a famous quote that comes from this book, somewhat famous, which encapsulates this thought. I'm going to paraphrase it. I've given the translators the paraphrase, so I'll read it in full. The principles of justice aren't built around what people deserve, and what people actually receive in life don't tend to match what they deserve anyway. What that quote is saying is not because what someone, or what it's trying to point out, should I say, is that if you're going to build a society, a just society, don't build it around what you think people deserve. Because what people actually get in life, it turns out, doesn't always line up with what they deserve anyway. And that's not because what someone deserves in life doesn't matter, but because behind this veil, before you know who you'll turn out to be, what someone deserves isn't something you can build the rules around. Because you don't know yet what anyone will deserve. You only know that everyone needs to be protected, whoever they turn out to be. So that thought experiment isn't asking who deserves what, given what we can see about these people now. It's asking what rules would you choose before you could see anything about the people on the other side. And so the point is that he is trying to make that the rules and rights come first, because the design comes before knowing who is talented and who isn't. John Rawls described this about this world and creating a just society today. But that's exactly what we're doing. Because we have our own version of that veil. We don't know how the second advent settles things for any of us specifically. What we're doing through these studies is this thought experiment. Before that veil can get lifted. We're trying to design a just society under the premise that we don't know what the other side looks like. Whether we'll have a big mansion or a small mansion, I don't know. So if I don't know that, I'm going to try and come up with a framework that will make sure I'm happy regardless. It's the only honest way to reason about justice at all. If you wait until that veil is lifted to ask what's fair, and all you're doing ends up being making excuses for whatever outcome you get. And this is the conclusion that God tried to give Job all those years ago. That a person's standing or their rights comes first. And if anyone deserves anything, then that comes after. And it can't be the other way around because you wouldn't like it the other way around. So once humanity could hold on to this idea, not just be told about it, the idea that a person's worth can't be tied to their merit or how hard they work. And I'm suggesting the populist backlash is evidence that humanity has arrived there. Then conditionality doesn't just become unnecessary, it becomes false and damaging. So this new covenant we speak of, that's meant to replace the old, can't be built on a system of gentler blessings or cursing and cursings. It has to be a different category altogether. We've described it as unconditionality. That's the category I described when we kicked off these studies a few weeks back. We frame it as unconditionality, but from where? Where does this unconditionality come from? And I'm going to suggest it's the law. So if you remember, there were two ways I described the law in France about a month ago. And I hope my translators had enough time to practice. Regulative law and constitutive law. Regulative law, that are rules about behavior, that talk about the consequences in one's life. These don't just fade away, they remain real. But constitutive law, rules about who counts, who has standing or who has rights, this gets secured. Can say the constitutive side of the law goes into effect. which can't be touched by conduct or behavior. Because of this graduation from child to adult. We love talking about inalienable rights. This idea that they can't be touched, which comes from the premise of natural law. That a person's rights come from who they are, or what they are. Inalienable rights were birthed through this understanding about law as being natural. Which says that a government cannot give you these rights because they were never theirs to begin with. These rights that exist aren't handed out by an institution. The rights exist because you exist. By just being a human, by being created. And so these inalienable rights that we worship, if we use the model of natural to spiritual, we've understood our inalienable rights on earth with relationship to human government. Then the spiritual government can't use conditionality to touch those rights. When we did that thought experiment about designing a society, the question that has been asked is, what's the purpose of this movement? A purpose, I won't say the purpose, is to take the decision of what society humanity lives in out of the hands of a being that we've never met, that we don't really know, and design a society that we'd be comfortable with. Because we're the ones who are going to have to live in it. And so when salvation was framed through meritocratic claims, it was always prove your worth and God will tell you what you're owed. But this alternative framing says that the law demands that your rights are respected by God and yourself. If standing was never earned, then how we think about this term grace needs to be reassessed, because grace ends up not rewarding the deserving. It ends up just being a description of what the law stands for, given who you already are. So grace is not God being generous or God choosing favorites because they listen to him. Grace is not this meritocratic mechanism. It ends up just being the law working itself out once someone's actual standing is taken seriously. I can see we're out of time. So I'll end with a phrase that Christians adore, which is the idea that if you do the right thing, you end up being one of the blessed and highly favored by God. By the grace of God, I made it through traffic. We've treated grace as a blessing landing on the deserving. Someone gets more of God, more insight, more favor because they've earned it. If grace worked that way, it wouldn't be grace. It would just be meritocracy with better words. I don't mean to preach as I go through this description, but we've made this exact same argument about ourselves as a movement. That we've worked hard to know God better than anyone else, so we must deserve more. More stars on our crowns, bigger mansions. We deserve to be saved. When I frame it that way, I hope you can see how, I don't know what the opposite of humility is, unhumble that is. That's just this meritocracy wearing religious clothes. And if we're not careful, we could just end up recreating the very limitations or weaknesses that the LIO had. We'll close there for now and pick it up next week as I try to reiterate the point that when we say by the grace of God, what we actually mean is by the grace of the law. That touches everyone, not just those that put in the effort. And nobody, not even God, can take away those rights that the law gives you. So I hope that through the week, we can think through what that costs God. Because it touches how we think about freedom of conscience, worship, judgment. Once none of that can be forced. Because the grace of the law extends to all. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, as I come before you and as we come before you, I pray that our emotions may be able to catch up with something that we may intellectually find convincing. For years, we've discussed the idea of inalienable rights under the premise that let's explore the natural to try and understand you, but we recognize that the emotions take longer to arrive at the implications of that. So I pray that you may be with us through that discomfort. This is my humble prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.